Chapter 4. The Southern Marshy Swamp Dwellers. Accounts of the fate of settlers and Native Americans congregated in the south of North America are with some Spanish flavor, but the outcome was about the same as for the inhabitants from Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and north by northeast. The Southeastern region owes its colonization roots primarily first to Juan Ponce de Leon, a crafty Spaniard who first encountered Taino, Calusa, and other indigenous people in what was called Pascua, Florida, or Flowery Easter, and Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Caribbean. Early in the 16th century, war canoes and arrows met these travelers from Iberia, and in 1521, Juan Ponce was mortally wounded. A successor, Panfilio de Narvaez, leading some 400 followers and many horses aboard maybe 5 ships, sought gold while ranging the west coast of Florida. Their fleet proceeded to the mouth of the Mississippi, where the entourage capsized and parties became engulfed in the southern swamplands. Very few survived, maybe 15. Narvaez treated the Indians brutally, and their response was predictable. Other Spaniards on similar missions for treasure and instilled with the faith fever of Catholicism moved from Mexico north into the interior of North America, notably Cabeza de Vaca, Hernando de Soto, and Vázquez Coronado. De Soto, too, like the Narvaez party, found his destiny in the depths of the Mississippi River. His expeditions, shopping for women and slaves and fabulous treasure among the natives, traversed areas of South and North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, and Texas. He died while harassing the Natchez people. His body finally weighted and sunk in the mighty river. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and diseases in general nearly wiped out the scattered opponents of the early Spanish conquistadors. Some tribes disappeared completely. Surviving Creeks and Choctaw native groups apparently collected members of scattered smaller tribal groups that had gathered near St. Augustine in Florida and Mobile in Alabama. Spanish Franciscan friars came to the New World, 1524, almost a century before the Jesuits, 1625, mixed with the French interlopers in the north. According to one source, the French converted approximately 10,000 native Indians to pseudo-Christian sentiments within about 40 years, whereas the Spanish missionaries converted more than double that, roughly 26,000, in their Florida missions alone. It is generally held, though, that Spanish converts understood even less the subtle meaning of the Christian faith, but followed the rituals anyway. Some undiscerning tribal members suspected that Franciscan baptism of dying victims of smallpox was an act of murder. Some Jesuits, on the other hand, covered for the trade in alcohol among many natives. These natives, in turn, perceived the liquid as a potential source of spiritual power. As Spanish missions melted away into the musty, swampy, jungly mist of dysfunction and succumbed to Indian attacks, the British trade with Creeks became a deciding factor of who would eventually rule these lands. But Creeks, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw undercut their own safety early on by engaging in intertribal warfare and slave raiding. The French crept down the Mississippi. Fort Maurepas was constructed in Biloxi in 1699, and Fort Mobile was completed about the same time in 1702. New Orleans' founding is set at 1718, and the colony of Louisiana took hold. By then it was the Creeks that had become, by some accounts, the most powerful Native American force in the Southeast.
From the time of its settlement by Scottish Highlanders in 1736 until after the Battle of Bloody Marsh in 1742, the town of Darien was in constant danger from the Spaniards of Florida. Often for weeks at a time, the Highland soldiers were absent from home on military campaigns, with only a few men left to guard the women and children, who, for safety, lived within the walls of the fort. On several occasions, the post was fired upon by Spaniards or their Indian allies. After the war with Spain was ended, the fort, no longer needed, fell into ruins but was rebuilt and armed during the Revolution, when it again saw action against the British forces.
The Tuscarora, meanwhile, negotiated in a precarious area on the northern edges of the Carolinas. Their habitations were assaulted by British-induced Yamasee warriors plus colonial militia forces. Swiss colonists led by Baron Christoph von Graffenried drove some Tuscarora residents from their lands without offering payment in 1711. The Tuscarora in turn combined with other smaller tribal allies and raided villages between the Neuse River and Pamlico Sound, killing some 200 settlers, including many children. The Baron Graffenried was captured and sued for peace, but settlers seized a local chief and roasted him alive. Peace, of course, did not follow. During later negotiations for the return of native captives, some Tuscarora were attacked and killed, while probably a couple of hundred Indian women and children were captured for the sale market. The sheer force of the settler movement steered the Tuscarora core communities northward until that tribal group eventually combined with the Iroquois Confederation, making it the Six Nations in 1722. The enclave of Charlestown, in current South Carolina, became one of the few bastions of safety for settlers in the South as the Yamasee turned on their once allied colonials who had fought the Tuscarora. But only scattered and occasional raiding took place. The Cherokee stayed out of the fray for a while with British blessings, but by the time the American Revolution spilled across the land, the Cherokee sided with the colonists. Along the Mississippi Basin, the Natchez first kept the Spanish left-footed in the 16th century while nursing a fragile curiosity in trade with the French. Hostilities, though, inevitably pitted Indians and friendly freed plantation slaves against these European overlords, too. In about 1729, French commander of Fort Rosalie, Sieur de Champart, was clubbed to death after capture. The warriors chose not to defile their weapons by killing him and so enlisted a low-caste native to do the beating. The Natchez campaigns wore out, of course, and the tribe essentially was driven to disease and collapse. Not far off, the Creek and the Choctaw, between 1730 and 36, waged an internal war on each other, egged on by British and French agitators. Early French links to the Choctaw had allowed the Allies to intimidate and confront the Chickasaw further south. These tribes ended up allied with the British and Loyalist forces in the South after the French departed the region in 1763.
Indian tribes seldom recognized clear exact boundaries to their lands. However, the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians came to accept as a dividing line the stream that flowed in this valley. It remained the boundary until both tribes moved to Oklahoma in the 1830s.
The Chickasaw commanded a choice piece of waterfront along the Mississippi River near present Memphis, Tennessee, Chickasaw. This location bisected trade routes for the French between New Orleans and Mobile in the south and the French settlements underway in the Illinois country. In 1735, de Bienville, Louisiana's governor, convened an army to invade Chickasaw. His forces even included armed Africans commanded by freed Africans, settlers, and troops. The Chickasaw warriors did not go away quietly and fought fiercely both the French and French-induced Choctaw attackers for several decades. Peace with the Choctaw finally came with the proclamation of 1763. In 1783, after the French Revolution, Chickasaw representatives joined others to sign peace treaties with Virginia at French Licks and agreed to expel Loyalist refugees from their land. The Americans again promised to block any white settlers from trespassing on Indian territory. By now, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole endeavored to assimilate the new political world surrounding them, taking on the clothing, religion, and activities of their American European neighbors. In particular, they took to adopting a plantation-style slave economy. Going forward, these Indians were referred to as the Five Civilized Tribes. Removals of the still intact Native American tribes inhabiting the southeastern U.S. began with a new law signed by President Andrew Jackson, the Great White Father. A senile piece of legislation labeled the Indian Removal Act. This is the law so bitterly opposed by Davy Crockett and that shortened the frontiersman's career as a legislator. The execution of the law's tenets by U.S. Secretary of War John Eaton forced a reorganization and relocation of mainly Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole Americans. Marches of these peoples, sometimes referred to as simply immigrant Indians, to the far side of the Mississippi was largely peaceful, but devastating to the morale and health of the members. Under the treaty, as noted earlier, the Choctaw were the first to move, given 3 years to relocate in stages to the new Indian Territory starting in 1831. The largest and most prosperous of the native groups, the Cherokee, was destined to disperse and relocate at the end of the Trail of Tears. They had fought alongside Jackson when he led U.S. troops against the Red Stick Creek in 1814, and also against the Seminoles a couple of years later. But they occupied prime agricultural land in the heart of the southern U.S. Pursuant to an 1828 treaty, a large number of Creek, or Muskogee Nation, left Georgia and Alabama, but many more stayed behind until land allotment arrangements were fixed. Some miscues led to an Indian attack on a steamboat on the Chattahoochee and a retaliation ending in the forced march of the Creek westward. Apparently, a large number perished in one of the snowiest, coldest winters recorded until then. The Seminoles in Florida, also called Lower Creek, were allowed to choose western lands in Oklahoma under an 1832 treaty. But a resentful leader, Osceola, waged a war that killed probably 1,500 persons, cost the country tens of millions of dollars. He was captured and imprisoned while approaching in a parley for truce in 1837. The United States first imprisoned Osceola, known to the settlers as Billy Powell, at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, then transported him to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. He died a few months later of causes reported as an internal infection or malaria. Osceola was then decapitated and presented in body for public display. George Catlin painted a portrait of the Seminole leader, probably while he was in captivity. Osceola was born as a Muskogee under the English name William Powell, but is famously known for his warrior name Vasayoba. Later in his childhood, his family and a group of Muskogee people moved to Florida after land disputes with the federal government. He is of the Five tribe and Bird clan. During the Seminole Wars in the 1830s, he became a prominent warrior who resisted settlers' encroachment on the traditional homelands. His most defiant moment was stabbing the Treaty of Fort Gibson in 1832 with the famous quote,
"This is how I will sign."
Finally, approximately 4,000 Seminoles trekked to the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers, settling near the already re-established Creek Nation. And yet small groups of Seminole and allies managed repeatedly to evade capture or removal. Billy Bowlegs is cited as one of the last Seminole leaders to surrender. The Alligator Chief, known to the whites as Chief Billy Bowlegs or Billy Bolek, eluded attention during the Second Seminole War at about 1835 forward. After the death of Osceola, Bowlegs and his band of about 200 warriors resisted removal and settled down in southwestern Florida for years. However, around 1855, with settlers agitating for land and government engineers destroying banana trees purportedly belonging to the Seminoles, Bowlegs made another guerrilla-style fight, labeled the Third Seminole War. He lost the fight, was bribed to leave the area around Fort Myers, Florida, and compelled, with the encouragement of Chief Wildcat, a Western Seminole, to move west across the Mississippi. The U.S. government offered Bowlegs $10,000 and his chiefs $1,000 each. Warriors and non-warriors were also offered cash. After some hesitation, it is said that 123 Indians agreed to relocation. Billy's Creek in Fort Myers, Florida, is named after Bowlegs, the spot where he was forced to surrender in 1858. After reaching Indian territory, Bowlegs and his daughters became prominent landholders. He is buried at Fort Gibson National Cemetery, Muskogee County, Oklahoma.